What's worse, old age or high hours? And for the sake of the conversation, we want to look at it from the assumption that the boat and engine are being used in, say, South Florida in the sun all year round in saltwater, opposed to a boat and engine being used in snow melted, clean as a whistle, freshwater with a 90-day boating season. But for those of you that are up there in that kind of a region, we want to thank our show sponsor, PartsView.com, because you can get all of the parts and items that you need to winterize your boat from PartsView.com. You can get a savings when you use the coupons and the link in the description below, saving up to $50 on convenience maintenance kits like Mercury, Yamaha, Suzuki, and even Mercruisers. So when it comes to winterizing your boat, get yourself a discount when you use the coupons and the link in the description below. Now, when it comes to age versus hours, everything is going to depend on you and your situation, because if you can do the work, then low hours is probably going to be a better bet. If you can't do the work, then high hours might not be as bad depending on what you think high hours is. Just for a point in case, a scenario, we just did a 2004 Boston Whaler that has 104 hours on the entire boat and engine. Now, this boat is a 2004, so it's 20 years old. It's been sitting for roughly 12, maybe a little bit more years. Even though it has low hours, the problem with sitting is that things lock up. So if you got something with higher hours, like we had an engine, they were there at the marina, it had 1,660 hours, but that thing was plug and play. It was like 8 years old, but you can put it on the boat and run it, and you don't have to do anything to it. Now, 1,660 hours is a little bit higher than you would generally want, but that's roughly 200 hours a year, which isn't really that bad. That's pretty common for someone to be able to put 200 hours a year on their engine, especially in South Florida. That's, you've got a very long boating season. But the reason those hours are not really that big of a deal is because the engine is being used all the time. Meaning the steering system, the latches, the components on the engine, everything inside the engine, the fuel system, the oil system, everything is running all the time. That means it's all being used, it's moving, it's staying lubricated, which helps to prolong the life of the engine. That's why it's usable. The engine that had 104 hours on it, that thing was locked up. The steering was locked up. The engine itself was not locked up. We were actually able to get that to start and run. It did have some hiccups because it had been sitting, meaning like the injectors were probably a little bit sticky when we first started it. The fuel pumps, a little bit sticky when we first started it. We had to make sure we oiled the cylinders to get everything lubed up. But the steering bracket itself was seized. It would barely move at all. It had blown out the steering cylinder when we tried to use it, and it probably had blown it out before that because there was a bunch of gunk and gum inside the steering bracket. So in order to be able to make that engine that only has 104 hours on it usable, you have to take the engine off the boat, take the pin that's in the steering bracket, attaching it to the actual midsection of the engine, drive that pin out, disconnect your trim sending unit, disconnect your trim rams, pull the trim unit out of it, and replace that entire unit there with the steering bracket and all that stuff. So that's a lot of work for someone to have to do in order to make that engine usable. Now that that engine has all that stuff done to it, though, it's an engine with 104 hours. It's in pristine condition. But again, talking about depending on your situation, like if you're not able to do that amount of work, then if you find a boat that's 20 years old and has been sitting for 12 years, even though it has 100 hours on it, you could be facing problems such as that where you need to do a lot of work to this engine to get it usable. So if your situation doesn't provide you the ability to do that, then something like the 1,600 hour engine isn't a bad choice. It's not like the 1,600 hours is worse than the 100 hours and the older engine. Just the amount of work that has to be done to each one to make them usable for you, it plays a big part or a big factor in which is going to be worse or which is going to be better. Because in my opinion, if you can do the work, the low hours is going to be the better bet. Because it is the lower hours, you have more life of that engine as long as it was taken care of, and the condition of the engine is generally going to be a little bit better, especially if it's just sitting somewhere that is, let's say, if it's inside, that's, you got yourself a steal right there. You might even not have to do much work at all. But like that engine there that was sitting outside in the sun, the boat itself, like here's a boat that's been sitting for 12 years. We actually have about 176 hours of work that went into the boat to make it usable. On the engine side, the steering had to come off. The steering brackets got to get fixed. The steering cylinders had to get replaced. The steering hoses had to get replaced. The entire boat had to be wet sanded, compounded, polished, and waxed. The pumps were all failing. The grounds, there was a lot of grounds to the stuff in the back. All that stuff had to get replaced. All the switches on the dash had to be redone. The dash itself had to get painted. The radio, the VHF radio, all that stuff had to get replaced because of just sitting there in the sun. It just destroyed all of that stuff. So low hours, but old age requires a lot of work to get it to where you want it to be. Whereas if you say take a boat that's 8 years, 6 years, let's go with 8. Let's say it's 8 years. So 8 years old with 1,600 hours on the boat, that boat is going to be way more turnkey than the other boat. You might have to fix a couple of things on the boat, but you're not going to spend 176 hours wet sanding and compounding and replacing all the electronics and redoing everything, new cushions, new upholstery, fixing up all the metal. Because the boat is 8 years old, that stuff is not in as rough condition, and hopefully, because someone's been using it and putting 200 hours a year on the boat, hopefully they were flushing the engine, they were washing the boat every time they took it out, if not, every other month or so. Maybe it actually got a coat of wax put on it throughout the years. So because it's getting that maintenance done to the boat is going to be way more turnkey and in way better shape. Even though it has those hours, it's going to be in much better, there's less work there. So therefore, depending on your situation, that's going to be a better buy and a better find and a better use for you, because 1,600 hours isn't really that much. Even if it's 2,000 hours, that's really not that bad if it's being taken care of. So used is way different than abused. So I'm not talking about abuse. If you want to talk about something that's being abused, like you got, say, 2,000 abused hours, like someone put 2,000 hours in a year on, in order to put that much time on the boat, you're going out all the time. So you're going out all the time, regardless of the weather. That means rough water, storms, all kinds of stuff. Like it's getting 2,000 hard hours on it, not 2,000 hours spread across 8 years, where it's 200 hours a year, which, you're going out when it's calm, you're going out on the weekends, you're only going to the sandbar, you're coming back, you're not running it all the time, like just balls to the walls, just tearing the thing up. So those are two different situations or scenarios that I would say is that high hours, but like used hours, or are we talking high hours and abused hours? So big difference there. But the age is generally going to be probably in worse condition than the high hours younger boat. And that's simply because a boat that just sits there in South Florida in the sun, it just falls apart. Now, with that being said, if you want to talk about a boat that's been sitting in a garage in the middle of Michigan with 100 hours on it and it's 20 years old, that boat's probably going to look brand spanking new and you won't have to do anything to it. So, there's that situation too. But generally, those are very, very hard finds. Like those boats aren't just, out there on Facebook Marketplace and out there on it's not like you can just go and buy that and pick that up tomorrow. The boats that we're talking about are boats that you could go pick up tomorrow. You could find either a boat with low hours that's been sitting for a long, long time, just drive around in a boating community and look at boats that's been, that boat's clearly been sitting there for a long, long time. And you'll be able to tell if it's got high hours or low hours just by pulling the engine data and seeing that, anything in the past, say 24 years, generally you'll be able to pull engine data and be able to see how many hours is on the engine, which if it's the same engine that came with the boat, that's how many hours are going to be on the boat. Now, if you don't work on the stuff, high hours, don't be afraid of it. Just make sure they are used hours, not abused. And, kind of get a backstory. Who owns the boat? What's it look like? Where's it been stored? How many hours are on it? Did you buy the boat original? Those kind of conversations when you pick up the boat they're going to tell you exactly what's up with the age versus the hours. Officer Dave 78 also says, how about 800 hours in 4 years? Similar discussion. And that's actually identical to my suggestion. Actually, 800 hours in 4 years, that's 200 hours a year. That's the normal. That is such a normal use for a boat. 16 hours a month, basically, which is basically 4 hours a weekend. So, obviously that's not how people use the boat. That's probably more like, 20 hours a weekend here, 20 hours a weekend there, going on a long fishing trip, getting 8 hours in a day. That's more likely what it is. But when you break it down, 200 hours in a year, 16 hours a month, 4 hours a weekend, that is very consistent boat usage. And I would say that is honestly probably what you want to see. When it comes to a used and hours, that's what you want to see. That means also your services. That means every 2 years that boat's getting a full service. Hopefully, should be getting a full service. So every 2 years, it's getting the lower units coming off. It's getting the oil change, the filters. It's cycling through fuel, so the fuel's not sitting in the tank, especially if people are putting ethanol in their fuel. If you put ethanol fuel in an aluminum tank and you let that thing sit for 12 years, that boat's going to need a fuel tank in it. That's something that you also want to think about too, is a boat that's been sitting, the fuel tank. If someone put ethanol in that thing, then you could have a problem with the fuel tank, because you can't let ethanol sit for that long. It'll absorb water. Now you got water sitting in your tank, and the water with the ethanol makes a very, very, very corrosive consistency, or mix, I guess you would call it, which is going to be just sitting there eating holes in that aluminum tank, which a big portion of the boats out there on the water have aluminum fuel tanks in them. So not what you want to see at all. Michaelise says, where do I look if my fuel gauge reads backwards? Full shows empty. Okay, so this is actually kind of an issue. It's actually more common than you would think it is, and it's probably something that a lot of people don't really know. So in general, in America, in ABYC or United States, North America, our fuel senders read it's 230 ohms at full and 30 to 40 ohms of resistance on the fuel sender. So at full, it's 230. At low, it's say 30 to 40 ohms of resistance. That's what reads the gauge. In a lot of European places or European nations or, European boats, the fuel senders are actually inverted. So full is going to be 30 to 40, and empty is going to be 230. So most likely you bought a fuel sender that's inverted. It's a European fuel sender, and there's not really a way to fix that. I don't think you can't just swap your black and pink on the sender and swap those out. That's not how that works. It's not. The sender is a resistance. So, if you just swap your black and your pink thinking that's not going to, I don't think that's going to work like that, because now, opposed to, it's sending voltage to that sender, it's receiving whatever, it's reading the resistance there based on the sensor and sending voltage. If you switch the black and the pink, you're just switching from positive to negative, voltage. So it doesn't work. It's the sender itself, the resistance at the top and the bottom are inverted, and there's no way to fix that outside of changing your fuel gauge to read an inverted sender, or changing the sensor to be a normal sensor that's not inverted. Ben Jap says, do you think today is worth it to become a mechanic with the electric cars industry growing and gasoline dying? Ben, absolutely. I think today is a prime time to become a mechanic. Actually, realistically, in my opinion, today is a awesome time to become any service-based person you want to be. Like if you want to get into skilled, learning a skill, becoming a mechanic, boat mechanic, car mechanic, plane mechanic, whatever, or a trim guy, a paint guy, a carpenter, an electrician, a plumber, like any service-based industry, right now, the amount of quality workers out there is very slim. The quality of work has gone so down that if you become really good at something like being a mechanic or anything like that, you can charge a premium price and people will pay a premium price to get quality work, because otherwise, they're stuck with what they already have, which is going places, spending an absorbent amount of money, and getting very, very poor quality work. So yeah, 100% totally worth it becoming a mechanic. And on the electric car industry growing and the gasoline dying, that's not true, especially not in the boating industry. Like there's more electric boat companies that are going out of business than there are gasoline boat companies. I mean, gasoline is here to stay for a few more decades when it comes to boats. Electric just ain't there. Hydrogen, it ain't there. And, there's always diesel. So gasoline for the distance that you go on a boat, the power that you need, and the mainly the speed that you want, gasoline is by far the most efficient, and it's also it's so available. Like in order to go to electric, it's not like you can just go buy an electric boat and boom, you're good to go. It's the electricity has to come from somewhere. You have to charge it. You can only go so far. It may work. An electric boat may work on the lake, but you ain't going offshore and going 40 miles to fish an oil rig and then coming back on electric. Ain't happening. And it ain't even close to happening. Now, electric diesel hybrids, all right, that's a discussion. But as far as your normal runabout center console offshore fishing boat, gasoline, electric ain't there yet. Super Chris Cunningham says, I'm buying an older boat that has a 1977 200 horsepower Mercury with lots of gauges. I prefer to keep the gauges to save lots of money. Smart man. The motor I'm buying is a 2006 115 horsepower 4-stroke Mercury. Is there an adapter I can use, or is it possible, or do I need to replace all the gauges? So on a 115, most likely that is all you're going to have. 2006, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's got the 14-pin harness. It might be the 8-pin. Not 100% sure on the harness, but it's probably going to come with an analog harness. So it plugs in the engine, and up at the front, it's just going to have a big spaghetti of wires, and they're all analog signals. So you might not get all the gauges that you have there to work, but you're going to get your RPM gauge, you're going to get a temp gauge, you're going to get a volt gauge, you're going to get possibly oil pressure. Not 100% sure if the 115 that you got is going to have an oil pressure sensor on it that's going to give you that, but you might even be able to get your trim sensor to work too. So yeah, you should be able to get most of those. You just need to have the analog harness, which most likely it's going to, you're buying a used outboard, so whether it comes with rigging or not, that's, I have no idea about the deal. But yeah, whenever you are repowering with stuff like that and you got all the analog gauges, all you need is the analog harness. If you buy a digital engine, meaning like, let's say a Verado or something that has more digital stuff to it than it does analog, then they do make converters to convert that stuff. But yeah, for what you're doing, a 77 200 horsepower Mercury and a 2006 115 horsepower. But actually, hold on here. I just realized you're talking about you bought an older boat that has a 1977 200 horsepower Mercury. So we're talking about a 200 horsepower engine. You're going to take that 200 off of this boat and you're going to put a 115 on there and a 4-stroke. You just cut your horsepower in half. You might want to kind of consider what you're doing there. I don't know the boat. I don't know the situation. I don't know where you're using it. But anytime that you take a boat with a 200 and you put a 115 on there, a 200 2-stroke to a 115 4-stroke, I don't know how well that boat's going to perform based on how it's probably performing now with the 200 on there. That's a massive, massive difference. So yeah, Just my opinion, just throwing that out there, something to think about. S. Cav Sable, love your videos. Question for you. Thank you. Just bought an O2 200 horsepower 4-stroke engine. I noticed that no water comes out the tail. When I flush with the hose connection, it will come out when I run the boat in water. It comes out weekly if I run earmuffs. And again, no telltale water when using just the hose attachment. Any suggestions? Most likely I'm going to be thinking about your hose pressure, because you might not have enough water pressure coming out of your hose. Because generally at 2000, you're going to get water to come out the telltale running the flush attachment. I don't know what brand. I mean, it's a 2002 200, but Yamaha, Mercury, Suzuki, they're all very, very different. I'd be looking at the hose pressure first, but then after that, you might have some kind of a blockage somewhere. But I'd be looking at that water pressure. It should, especially, and then also if it comes out fine when you're running the engine, then I'd follow that hose for your flush. Brett Latta says, thanks for this. Do you think this would work for a 2020 Pro XS 225? The exhaust is loud at idle up to about 6 miles per hour, then quiets down. Anything under that, and it sounds almost like the motor's out of the water. And I actually commented on this, and he commented back. So my first statement is that that's normal. So the 2020 Pro XS 225 or any of the Mercury Pro XS 225 or 200 to 300, they are tuned to sound performancy. Like, it's the way it's supposed to sound. It's supposed to sound at idle. It's going to have like a growl to it. But then at cruising speed and wide open throttle, it's going to be a lot quieter. Then also some of the other ones have the advanced sound control or whatever they call it, where you can turn on sport mode and turn off sport mode, which it basically is just like it's just a valve that whenever you click it, it just opens up, which lets the exhaust out above the water, which makes it sound like Silent Choice. Like, it doesn't even sound like Silent Choice though, because an outboard's exhaust sound versus an inboard block sound, like a big block, like sound completely different. And, I know everybody likes the sound of the inboard. Silent Choice above the water sounds awesome. I'm with you. The outboard, it sounds kind of weak, I guess in concept it's cool, but I don't really know if it's that cool. Sport mode, it is what it is. So to some people, I guess it's cool. But I guess it was way louder than what you're describing here. And he said that the exhaust hose was actually off. So the exhaust hose was actually off and it was just dumping right out into the cowling. So it's like, that thing would have been stupid loud. So he just put the hose back on, but that's what's going on there. Chief Sits on a Bowl says, love, no matter how many times I tell my cousins to remain in the boat until I'm done talking about docking, they jump forcefully off the bow just before I'm done ruining a good docking. Yeah, that's something that you got to get people to stop, to especially like when I run a boat, it's like, don't touch the dock. Don't touch anything. Stay in the boat. Don't reach your hands out. Don't be pushing this. Don't be pushing that. You ain't got to catch the boat. Like, we're going to put this boat right here. Like, don't worry about it. As soon as we bump that dock, then you can grab the piling, grab the lines, but stay in the boat. I've seen too many people and heard too many stories of people, especially like trailers and stuff like that. People like smashing their hands and their fingers and like trying to stop the boat. The boat has rub rails. The boat fiberglass is fixable. Let it hit. Like it's fine. Like, if you scratch the boat, okay, that's fine. If you lose your hand or your fingers, that's no joke. Like it's crazy. People always want to try and like stop the boat and protect the boat. It's like, forget that. Like, you're going to lose your hand. So yeah, that's something. I'm glad you said that. And yeah, it does. So when they jump off, that forces the boat back. And now all of a sudden you lost your bow and you're way over here. And like, now you got to come and go back on the docking. So yeah, keeping people in the boat when you're trying to dock, that messes you up. I mean, when you push off, as soon as you step off the boat or anything like that, you change the weight, the distribution, and you force, like, yep, you mess it all up. But yes, please, people, when you're trailering the boat or docking the boat, stay in the boat. Don't put your hands out there. I mean, like the guideposts on trailers, people trying to guide the boat or whatever, and they get their hand in between the rub rail and the trailer, the guideposts. Oh, it's bad. That's bad. B9 2019, can salt pitting or is it electrolysis be removed from my boat's aluminum tower? Oh, unfortunately, no. Once you got pitting or you got electrolysis on the aluminum on your T-top or your tower, any of that, like it's done. You can't, like, you know, it's done. The metal is degrading and it's eating away at the metal. It's gone. Like the metal is gone. So no, you can't fix it. It can't, like, you'll remove the electrolysis, but the pitting will always be there in the aluminum. And you know what you could do to stop it, like you can clean it and like stop it and then powder coat it to cover it up. It'll look pretty good. But no, once aluminum is pitted or electrolysis is taking effect, there's no fixing it. That metal is gone. Omar is coming, yo. So it looks like I got a wire fan here. Says cruising is not 4,300 RPM. It's about 3,200. Depend boat size and engine setup. Nothing above 3,500 RPM. I'm going to have to agree to disagree on that one because there's some boats out there, like you said it. I mean, you said it. Depending on the boat size and engine setup, your cruising speed is going to be determined upon that. But there's a lot of bigger boats, especially like, say, a 12,000 pound, 34 foot boat, center console. Some of them have a hull, like a planing speed of 3,200 RPM, which means that boat below 3,200 RPM won't be on plane. So RPM is never really the dependent upon what determines your cruising speed. Your cruising speed is your speed and the performance of the boat. So like, how is the boat performing at what speed? And your fuel economy. That's how you determine your cruising speed. And, you know, if a boat is underpowered or overpowered or underpropped or overpropped or whatever the situation could be, every boat's going to be different. The cruising speed's going to range all over the map compared to, you know, the RPM of the engine as far as that's concerned. A lot of boats, 34s, 36s, 28s, 32s, those twin engine mid-range runabouts, cruisers, walkarounds, center consoles, a lot of those, the RPM for an outboard boat, the RPM cruising speed is generally 4,000 to 4,500, somewhere in there, because a lot of those boats, the haul speed is like 32 to 3,500 RPM, like, so, or the planing speed. So as soon as you drop below that, the boat just falls off plane. It won't stay up on plane. But as soon as you get up to 42, 43, 45, 39, somewhere in there, you're running 20, 25, 30, 35 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, depending on the boat and the speed. Put some trim in that engine. You can bring your RPM down a little bit, keep that speed, and you'll find if you watch your fuel burn, generally, I would say your cruising speed is going to be determined by your fuel burn. You will find a sweet spot in the boat with your trim and your RPM and your speed. So you will notice, like, as long as the boat is propped properly, you will get up on plane, you can trim your engine up a little bit and say you find whatever speed it may be. Let's say it's 30 miles an hour because it's an easy to determinant of how far you can go. You're 30 miles an hour. It's going to take you 30 minutes to get, you know, you can do the math on that one easily. So if 30 miles an hour is your desired speed, then you can, based on your trim and your fuel burn, you will find the sweet spot with your RPM and that speed and your trim to where you'll know what RPM is going to keep you there. And the RPM is also going to change depending on the current and the wind. Wind and current are massive determinants on, you know, what's going on. So if you're going against the current, you're going to need a lot more RPM to keep that same speed as you would, you know, going with the current. So yeah, I don't think RPM is really the best determinant of what your best cruising speed is going to be. I think you find your cruising speed and your fuel burn, and then whatever RPM that is, that's what it's going to be. Morsey Man says, I don't recommend Suzuki outboards. It is by far the most troublesome outboard we receive in the shop. No ifs, ands, or buts. They do have nice cowling designs, though. Yes, Australia is coming after the two-strokes as well, even though no one is coming after container ships running the most disgusting and polluting bunker oil. You know what I've kind of found is that depending on where you work at, so if you work at a Mercury dealership or a Mercury, facility, you're going to see a lot of broken Mercuries. If you work at a Yami dealership, you're going to see a lot of broken Yamahas. If you work at the Suzuki shop, you're going to see a lot of broken Suzukis. Now, also depending on where you're at and how people are using their boats, generally, if you're close to the ocean, you're going to get a lot more people that are more abusive to boats. So if you're on the lake and people are running on smooth water, calm, and they're not really getting that much speed, like, you're not going to see as much abuse. People that go offshore and try and run all the time, you're going to see a lot more abuse. So we're talking about loading and unloading the engine. We're talking about salt water. We're talking about care. We're talking about maintenance, like all that kind of stuff. The abuse that the engine takes, some manufacturers are going to be able to take that abuse a lot more than others. But I think what I found is that wherever you work, that's what you're going to see the most of. So probably wherever you're at, they just seem to have that issue. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Michael and Mary says, I have seen discussions on what is costing guys outright speed in a boat, and some comments I've seen guys are losing up to 6 miles per hour due to bottom paint and a bimini. Have you seen this much? I'm coming to Palm Beach Boat Show next year, all the way from Australia. Is it a good boat show? So as far as the boat show, the West Palm Boat Show is a good boat show. It definitely ain't Flibs or Fort Lauderdale. It's definitely not Miami International. So if you could go to Fort Lauderdale or Miami, those are massive shows. Obviously, yeah, you probably don't have that big of a boat show, scene in Australia as you do here. West Palm is a good show. So yeah, it's a good show, but it's not nearly as big as the other two. So, there is that. But as far as the speed goes, 100% bottom paint, you could probably see a loss of 2 miles an hour, maybe 3, somewhere in that region there. And then a bimini top, a bimini top for sure, that thing's like a parachute on top of the boat, just catching wind. And like we were just saying with the speed and the cruising speed, the wind is a major factor. It's just like, think about your car. When you're running down the highway at a certain speed, you're going to have a certain fuel burn. As soon as you brake, say 75, 80, 85, the fuel consumption just tanks. And that's because the wind, the wind is the major factor. And so once you break that speed, now all of a sudden you're fighting that much more wind. And especially if you get into a windy situation. Same thing on the water. The wind, the boat's going through, the bottom paint is basically like sticking it to the water, and it's rough. It's not slick. So if you take a boat that is polished gel coat with a hydrophobic something on it, being a wax or a ceramic or whatever, that coating on it where water doesn't stick to that, there's less drag, less friction. Bottom paint is very abrasive. It's not really abrasive, but there's a lot of texture there, so you're going to lose a couple miles an hour. The bimini, just think of it as a parachute on the top of the boat. So as you're going along, that parachute is just grabbing wind and pulling the boat backwards. So yeah, 6 miles an hour with bottom paint and a bimini, for sure you could lose that much. You could easily lose that much, which is kind of why bimini tops, you want to be able to remove them from the boat, or you want to be able to put them down. So as long as you can kind of put them down or remove them, depending on how big it is, some boats like this Boston Whaler we just did, we put a 4-bow on that one. So that kind of bimini is a little bit harder to take off. But yeah, they consume a lot of speed. Brandon Powerstroke says, I was thinking about repowering my current boat, but now I'm leaning more towards buying a bigger boat. Several of the boats I'm interested in have Yamaha 350s. Is there any way to tell true hours in the 2010 to 2015 year range? Most of them are low hours, but that may be because of the recall ECU replacement. Is it best to just stay away from the 350s and get something with 300s instead? So I want to say that the ECUs were only changed on the Generation A models, which was like 07 to 11, something like that. Don't quote me on the years. I'm pulling off the top of my head. But like the Generation B being the 11 to the 15 or 16, whatever it was, and then the C's 16 or 15 above, even better. So I want to say the ECU replacements were only on Gen A. So if you're looking at a 2012 Gen B F350, that thing probably didn't get an ECU replacement. It probably, it's going to be original. If you get a Generation A, yeah, depending on when the ECU is replaced, there ain't no way of going back for that. Depending on the tach situation. So depending on what the gauges are on the setup, some of the gauges, like just a regular old 65 or whatever, the gauges store hours. So the hours on the gauge are what the boat has. It's not the engine ECU. The download that you pull from the engine is going to give you whatever's on the ECU, but what's on the gauge is going to be what's on the gauge. So if the boat has the gauge, that'll be your true hours because those don't get replaced. As far as staying away from the 350s and going to the 300s, I mean, Gen B and Gen C 350s, I think they're a good engine. They're reliable. You still got the flywheel problem. It's still a harmonic balancing issue. Probably the timing, the firing order, unsure exactly what the true issue is there with the flywheels, but they're not a terrible engine. I don't think they're unreliable. The flywheel issue is just what it is. That's that cruising speed. Back to cruising range being the 350 is 3,700 to 4,200. So for a lot of boats, especially a boat running 350s, is probably the cruising speed is somewhere in that maybe 4,000, 4,100. So more than likely your cruising speed is going to be 43 to 45 just to stay out of that range, because at that range, that's what makes them come apart. The 300 though, the 4.2 liter Yamaha 300, I mean, stupid reliability right there. So you ain't going to go wrong with any 4.2 300, 100% on the 300. You ain't going to go wrong there. So hope that helps in your decision-making process. NQ2847 says, due to life changes, I only put 4 hours on my boat this year since the last 100-hour service. I don't really need to change the oil, right? So sorry for the life changes and all that, whatever happened. Hope everything's all right. But 4 hours since the last 100-hour service, what does that mean? I mean, your last 100-hour service, was that last year? Was that 3 years ago? Was that, how long ago? What are we talking about here? Like, back to the age thing. So if you're talking about you only put 4 hours on this year and the oil was just changed a year ago, then, I mean, realistically, oil breaks down. So, oil breaks down, it gets contaminated. With 4 hours of usage, that's not enough to contaminate the oil. I probably wouldn't be too concerned about it. If the oil's, 4 years old, then, you might want to think about changing that because oil's going to break down. I don't know the chemical makeup and the time frame, how long it takes for oil to break down, what it loses in viscosity and all that other stuff. I'm not a chemist, so I don't know about that, but I would say if it's only been a year and you only got 4 hours, then that oil's gonna be fine to run. You might be wanting to change your filters, maybe like your water separator, that's got a paper element. So your oil filter, that's got an element in there too. The paper element can break down, so those are generally, you kind of want to change them every year, just because that as soon as you use it, that paper's, it's going to start breaking down. And depending on the quality fuel that you have, that's also another concern. So that's just kind of my opinion. I mean, if you think about it, what happens to oil that's sitting in the store for, say, a year? I mean, it's like, is that oil bad? Probably not. I mean, it's probably not going to hurt anything to go run that oil. So that's my opinion. But if you're talking about 3 years ago was your last 100-hour service, then that's something else. You kind of want to do a service, drop that lower unit, get some grease on stuff. That's kind of a different discussion. And we'll do one more from Ari Richardson. He says, in terms of reliability, would you say the 3.3 liter F250, talking about Yamaha obviously, is just as or even more reliable than an F150 or an F200? No, I wouldn't say that. I would not say that the 3.3 is more reliable than the F-150. I think the F-150 and the 4.2 liter four strokes are Yamaha's most reliable engines there are. The F200 is completely different. So like the F-150 is a 2.7 liter. The F200 is a 2.8 liter. They are different. You've got individual coils on the F200. You got Siamese coils on the F-150. They are different, you know, in the way they operate. The 3.3 liter is a stupid reliable engine. It is not very powerful. I will say that it is not the most powerful engine, but as far as reliability is concerned, as long as you do the service and you maintain it, it'll be all right. One thing that I will say about the F-250, though, is if you got a 2004, 2005, 2006, you got a midsection problem there. So that is going to be a concern. So, you know, that is one comment that would play into your reliability. So if that midsection 04, 05, 06 is corroding, if it's been sitting a while, that corrosion, we have seen them go up into the power head, which kills the power head. So I would say that gets a check on your what makes it reliable versus unreliable conversation. But compared to the F-150, the F-150 is probably the most reliable engine they made. The 4.2 liter is probably the next most reliable engine they made. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to rank Yamaha models as in reliability because Yamaha doesn't really make unreliable engines. I mean, like that is a thing. Like, you know, Yamaha makes reliability. Like that's it. Like that's what they make. They make reliable outboards. And even the Z200, their OX66, the two strokes, the 70, 90, 130, the 115, like, I mean, the 60, like they're all reliable. I mean, most of them come back to the maintenance factor, and if you abuse them and you don't take care of them, then yes, they can be unreliable. But at the same time, you've seen that boat guy throw the 9.9 or whatever that thing was in the water running, pack the carburetor full of sand, pour water into the intake, like, and then just clean it out and boom, run it. Like they are stupid reliable. So I don't think you can really say that one is less reliable than another. I think they're both super reliable. Just something to think about with the midsection on that F-250.